Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have something just a little bit different. Tonight we have creepy encounters with otherworldly beings. I'll let you imagine what that means. As always, if you do enjoy the video, please be sure to drop a like rating as it helps out the channel immensely. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, as I post videos similar to this one all of the time. I am also settled into my new place, and I plan on uploading a lot more going into the future, so I hope you're all excited for that. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Names were changed because this was a pretty high profile case where I was from. I'll be referring to myself as my handle. Something freaky happened and it's pretty late at night and I just really need to talk to someone. The elementary school I went to was situated between a suburb and a forest. It was cool for me as a kid because I lived in a different suburb on the other side of the forest. Meaning when I didn't feel like waiting for the bus, or missed it, I could just take a shortcut through the forest and be there in about 15 minutes. Of course my teachers would be pissed because my boots and pants would be splashed with mud, but cutting through the forest meant you were cool. It meant your parents trusted you to do things on your own. It meant you weren't afraid of the old man who lived in the box. It was an urban legend at my school. Way off in the forest, you could see a cardboard box partially covered up by the brush. Everyone said that there was an arm creeping out of it, gnarled and bony, but it was probably just a branch. I only saw it once when one of the boys in my class hauled me up onto the monkey bars where you could see it. One of the downsides of being so little, even in 3rd grade. Austin pointed it out to me and said, "That's where the old man lives." "What old man?" I asked. He rolled his eyes. "The one who lives in the box. Duh." It was said that once a year, usually in the spring, the old man would snatch a 3rd grader from the playground. It would happen in a flash and the teachers would never care, no matter how much you cried or screamed. And so a gaggle of 3rd grade boys would sit up on the monkey bars I could never reach on my own, and watch the box every recess. I always thought they were stupid. It was just a rumor, like Bloody Mary or Baby Blue or Charlie Charlie. I'd done all of those and nothing happened. So there was no reason to believe that the old man who lived in the box was anything more than a silly urban legend. I was playing with my friend Jenny that day. It was cold out, and I'd worn a baby blue velvet hoodie over my sweater. Jenny was always cold, so I lent it to her. I would probably get too hot in it anyways. We were close like that. Our teacher, Mr. B, liked to call us 2 halves of a whole idiot. It might have had something to do with us trying to publish an unsavory article in the school's paper, all about the swear words kids wrote in crayon in the girls' bathroom. We had one of those jungle gym domes at my school. It wasn't as popular as the swing set or basketball hoops or the playground, so Jenny and I had it to ourselves. One of our favorite games was for me to hang upside down from my knees from the top of the dome, grab Jenny by the hands and swing her around. Her laugh sounded like chimes, hollering, and I tried to swing her higher and higher. The sound was seared into my memory, like the after image of the sun when you've been staring at it too long. The lunch monitors blew their whistle, telling us it was time to come in. I dropped Jenny and grabbed the bar underneath my knees to flip it to the ground. I swear, my eyes were only off her for a second. Not even that. But when I landed, Jenny was gone. I was confused at first. Jenny was a fast runner, so she might have darted away before I could see her. I tugged on the sleeve of Austin when he walked by. "Hey, have you seen Jenny?" I asked. "She must have run off to class, but she has my hoodie on and my mom will be angry if I come home without it." None of them would look me in the eyes. None of them would tell me what happened. None of them would say anything as I shouted and chased after them. They didn't have to. I froze in place, unable, unwilling to move as the realization dawned over me. People don't just vanish into thin air like that. And my hoodie was so bright. I would be able to see her a mile away in this dreary weather. "Maggie, come on." I ignored the lunch monitor. I had to force each grueling step in the other direction. It shouldn't have made me feel like someone had dumped slush down my back, but that's what each step towards the forest was like. I was cool. I was brave. I probably should have gone to class to see if Jenny had gone ahead of me, but when you're little, you can convince yourself of anything, and I'd convinced myself that going to the box would prove to me that this was all just a joke. I usually entered the forest from the back of the school, not the side. There was no pathway cleared out, and it was full of brambles and thorny vines. Not like I cared. I was tunneled in on that box, and everything, even the cold and the stinging of the plants and my teacher yelling, were lost on me. I almost got tripped over some vines, almost like something was grabbing my ankle as I neared the box. I didn't even know what to expect when I looked inside. Jenny, ready to pop out and make fun of me. Nothing. I kept my eyes closed, trying to psych myself up to look. All the while, I could hear my teacher, Mr. B, as he struggled through the foliage. Jenny was in the box, and for a brief moment, relief washed over me. But it was just that. Brief. A split second while my brain processed the deep purple, almost black bruises around her throat and all over her naked body, and her eyes so wide and terrified it looked like they were almost popping out of her head. I couldn't stop staring, and didn't until Mr. B came and swooped me up. "Don't look, Maggie. Close your eyes. Close your eyes." Everything after that was kind of a blur. Everyone was sent home, of course. The bus drivers and parents even had to come directly to the classrooms to pick up their kids. I was in the principal's office the entire time, being questioned by police. My mom worked in the office, so once the staff were given the A-OK to leave, she took me home. My life and the school was like a circus show the next month or so. Everyone wanted to know what exactly had happened to Jenny, why I hadn't seen her leave, why she went into the forest, and of course, who did this to her. I swore up and down I only looked for a second, but the more I said it, the less and less grown-ups believed me. At the end of the day, they chalked it up as a victim of a copycat, of a child killer who was active in our area a few decades ago. They started up a manhunt, but it fizzled out after a year when there was no new evidence or new victims. It's weird to say, but it wasn't too hard to move on from Jenny's death. You'd think it would be traumatic, and maybe it was, but I'm functioning just fine now as an adult, some dozen or so years later. I'm only writing this up and posting now because I was up visiting my dad when something happened. I'm a bit of a night owl, so I was up late scrolling through movies on demand. I must have nodded off at some point because I woke up to the glass front door banging against the frame. My cat was always an escape artist. Thankfully, he was never too hard to find. He always headed off into the woods near our house. I grabbed a flashlight and a bag of treats and headed out. It took me a half an hour of looking around before I finally found the old bastard. I shoved the treats into my pocket and flung my cat over my shoulder, debating how I was going to punish him when I got home. Revoking his treats and making him sleep in the living room seemed fair enough. But I saw it, just briefly out of the corner of my eye. A box. There was an inkling of familiarity, mostly just gross curiosity at what had been dumped in the forest this time. I peered inside and the box was almost empty. In the corner, glowing almost neon, was something blue and neatly folded. My blood ran cold when everything clicked. I nearly fell over. It was that baby blue velvet hoodie. I'm not an athletic person, especially not when carrying a cat who weighs more than he probably should. But I sprinted the entire way home. I locked myself away in my room, and I'm currently hiding underneath my covers as I type this out on my phone. I'm just really hoping that tapping sound in my window is just a tree branch. The first time, he only took a tooth. I was 6 years old and our dog Harley, a Labrador Collie cross, was dying. He lay on our couch, head in my mother's lap, whining in his sleep. We had taken him to the vet that morning. I remember sitting in the waiting room holding my rolled up comic and trying to hear the muffled voices of my mother and the vet through the door. She told me years later that they had offered to put Harley down, but she couldn't go through with it. He had been with us all my life. I had no siblings and never knew my father. The three of us were all the family I had ever known. I prayed for Harley that night, the way a child does. Did you ever do that? Not to anyone or anything specific. Certainly not to God. We weren't religious at all. I just prayed generally to anyone or anything that would listen. Whispered words under covers. I thought it was something people did when they needed help, you know? Didn't really understand. I often wonder if this was how it all began, offering up such innocent need to whatever was listening. When I fell asleep, I had a dream unlike any other I had ever experienced. The dream world. White on white as far as I could see in every direction. An odd shimmer in the air. Distortions which seemed to be forming shapes but never quite succeeding. Hello? I spun around at the voice. There was a man there, tall and thickly set. Other features were not so easy to recall. To focus on him felt like watching an image on water. He seemed ill at ease in his clothing. I remember that, and uncomfortably warm. There was always sweat on his brow, or being wiped from his palms. I was surprised more than afraid. At that point, he was not threatening in any way. Indeed, he went out of his way to appear otherwise. I see that now. Your name is Adam, isn't it? His voice was friendly, though a little strained. Yes, I replied. I heard my own voice and became aware, quite clearly, that I was dreaming. There was the clarity you have when you know something is truth. You're right, you know, he said, bending at the waist to bring his eyes level with mine. This is just a dream, but I am very real. And I would like to help you, Adam. He never came too close, just smiled, wiping at his mouth, gaze fixed on me. Your dog is dying, isn't he? Your friend. Very sad, of course, but... He met my eyes and grinned. I can help him. Really? Oh, yeah. But I need a little something from you, Adam. Just a small thing. Nothing vital. What is it? He smiled. Your tooth. How did he know? I thought. I felt the loose one in my mouth. It had been that way for a week now. I had been pushing it around with my tongue all day. But it isn't out yet, I said. Oh, I know. You will need to help it along. Just a little. You want me to help Harley, don't you? I did, of course. Do you want your friend to live or die, Adam? I can help, but only if you do your part. Now, before you wake, if you want to save him, you must be quick. You have to do it and hand it to me. He never took his eyes off mine. I thought I could be brave, couldn't I? I could do it to save my dog, couldn't I? I pushed with my tongue until it hurt. It wouldn't be enough. Tick, tick, Adam. We're running out of time. I reached into my mouth and got a hold of the tooth between two fingers. Do it quickly. I pulled. The taste of blood was in my mouth. My eyes watered and I heard myself cry. Then something snapped and the blood rushed out, spilling suddenly onto the floor. Here, here. The man snapped his fingers at me and held out his hand. Spittle was running down his chin. He reached out and clumsily, hungrily, snatched the bloody tooth, eyes fixed, brow glistening with sweat. Then he popped it in his mouth and ate it like a candy. I woke to the sound of its slippery crunch from between his wet lips. Heart racing, I lay there in my bed. Morning light stinging my eyes. I felt for my tooth. It was gone. Just a smooth hole where it had been. I told my mother about the missing tooth and she said not to worry. I must have swallowed it in my sleep. These things happen. It was quickly forgotten with our happiness over our Harley's recovery. He was there at my bedroom door when I got up, wagging his tail and ready for walks. Everything was good again. I never told anyone about my dream. Stupid. He still died a month later. Gone in his sleep, cold by the morning. I found him as I was the first one downstairs calling his name. I remember standing there for a long time, silent, frozen in the moment, watching his limp body and feeling that gap in my mouth. Now, all these years later, I am watching in silence again. I can't let her see me. I wouldn't want to scare her. Do you understand how you can love someone enough to leave? Every year that passes, I retreat further into the dark, away from prying eyes. Out in the world, she lives her life, perfect and beautiful. Every movement and word and moment. The pain swells and blooms inside, and I think I cannot miss her any more than I do. I could not survive it. Then another day comes, and somehow I do. My mother was in a car accident when I was 18. Icy roads, a tired truck driver, blood, and broken glass. A phone call. She was in a coma when I reached the hospital, covered in bandages, eyes closed. Didn't have long, they told me. I was consumed by regret more than anything. We had been growing apart for years. All the things I hadn't said and had taken for granted were haunting me. All the things I had assumed would be there in the future until time ate them up. She gave me unconditional love from the moment I was born, and all I had to do was be there for her. Yet still I failed. I would have given anything to speak to her once more, if only for a few hours, to tell her everything I could and to listen. I cried like a baby by her bed, memories cutting me every time I closed my eyes. After 36 hours, I fell asleep in the waiting room, holding a lukewarm cup of tea. Hello again, Adam. You remember me, don't you? The white-on-white world, the man in the ill-fitting suit. Yes, I remember you. You said you would save my dog. And I did I not? You cannot buy immortality. Don't be a fool. He wiped at his lips. Heat seemed to radiate from him. Only a little at a time, Adam. That's how it works. A tooth doesn't get you much. A few weeks for a dog. That's fair. Don't you think that's fair? I don't know. Oh, you do. You do. He smiled and wiped his hands on his chest. And here you are again. Your poor mother, yes? So close already. Images of her flooded into my mind, and I was ashamed of forgetting her, even for a second. She doesn't have long, Adam. He wanted me to say it, I realized. Can you help her? Oh yeah, of course I can help. What do you want? Tell me. An hour. A few hours with her. My voice cracked as I answered. What? Speak up. I want to talk to my mom. His eyes burned into me for a moment before he looked over my shoulder. I followed his gaze. A table had appeared behind me. There was a knife on it. A finger. He says. For an hour with her. He was licking at his lips, dabbing at the corners of his mouth. I couldn't take my eyes off the knife. Just as before, Adam. Do it quickly, then give it to me. I didn't have a choice. The knife was heavier than it looked. The pain, just as expected. I almost stopped more than once when it became too much or I couldn't cut through. But I kept going. I didn't have any choice. I had slumped to the floor, shaking and soaking in sweat, when he took my severed finger. Then he ate it in front of me. I was woken by the sound of someone calling my name. Cold tea had spilled into my lap and a nurse had put her hand on my shoulder. I had to go with her, she said. My mother was awake. I tried to reply, to get to my feet, but I was frozen in place, staring at the stump where my finger had been, staring at the skin, smooth and perfect as if it had always been that way. I watched her go through her day, from across roads, through windows. I will phone her tonight, but I can't speak, of course. It will be worth it to hear her voice. It will all be worth it. Do you understand? I didn't have a choice. When my daughter was 1 year old, she had a seizure. Ambulances and hospitals followed. Tears and sleepless nights for myself and my wife. There is no fear like it. After a week of tests, the doctors invited us in to speak with them. Their words were quiet and kind and stunk of finality. Our daughter would not get better. She had another year at most. They could make her comfortable. There is no emptier place in the world than the future without your child. You would do anything to change it. Anything. I told my wife and stared again at my missing finger, remembering how I had hid it from people, made up lies about an accident, but most of all I remembered his words. Of course I can help. What do you want? Tell me. That night, I watched my daughter sleeping in her cot, perfect and beautiful, and I knew what I had to do. Eventually, I slept. He was waiting for me in the white. He did not show himself at first. He remained behind me, hot breath on my neck. I heard splashes on the ground, saliva running from his mouth. He cast a larger shadow now than the man I had seen before. How much time can I buy her? I asked. There was a table in front of us with shining cutlery, many bone-handled knives. Oh, many years, many years. His voice was thicker, heavier. It depends. How much you are willing to give. How long we can make you last. His hand, no. It was no longer a hand. His claw was on my shoulder. But we shall find out, he whispered. Yes, we shall. In time, I would see him as he truly was. By then, of course, it was much too late. He walked past me and picked up a spoon, gave it a tap on the table. Let's start with an eye. That was 15 years ago. I had to leave my wife, my family, hide myself away. I couldn't conceal what was happening to me. I couldn't explain. I could only go on. But now my time is running out. So hers is too. My daughter. I have so little left to give. One eye, one arm, both legs, of course. I've been in a wheelchair for a decade. Teeth, gums, tongue. My voice with them, all gone, eaten away. I sometimes wonder, how am I still alive? If you can call this life, waking up hollower than I was, after a night of cutting and blood and horror. You don't really need both kidneys, did you know that? So many organs and bones are not essential. I am afraid to sleep now. There won't be many more times. I think of the voice of the thing in my dreams, the bloody mouth and grasping claws, as I lie on that white floor in a pool of red, deadened by the pain, listening to the clink of cutlery and smack of lips. I will tell myself, I cannot face this again. Then I will think of my daughter, of buying her a little more time, and I will sleep. My name is Joshua. I'm an infantryman with a private military outlet I cannot name. We are currently deployed on security detail in a war-torn corner of Africa. Our mission has gone horribly, horribly wrong, and I don't think we're fighting insurgents or terrorists anymore. Our entire force will be moving out soon. I'm not sure we will be coming back. Whatever we've come across here, it's not natural. It's not of this earth, and it wants us all dead. I was part of the team that found it a week ago. It was supposed to just be a routine patrol. Our objective was to make sure there was no enemy movement in the vicinity of our base, and no threat to the one local settlement in the area. It was a hot, dry day. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the scrub-covered plains that we moved through gave no protection against the elements. Not even a single tree to throw a little shade. I was sweating horribly, my head lowered to shield my eyes against the glare of the sun. Because of this, I barely managed to stop in time to avoid colliding with Harris, my squad mate. He had been in position in front of me, but had stopped without warning. What's going on, man? I asked, walking around him. What's the holdup? Harris was motionless, his face screwed up in confusion. Something's wrong with my radio, Josh, he answered at last. I leant in closer and immediately heard what he meant. His radio was giving off strange, squawking sounds mixed with a high-pitched buzzing. "What's the delay?" came a yell from up ahead. Our superior, Sergeant Wright. I cursed inwardly. Wright was a hard son of a bitch, and I didn't want him thinking we were slacking. "Equipment malfunction, sir," I answered quickly. "Radio's acting up." Sergeant Wright walked over to us. The rest of the patrol, some 5 men, cast annoyed glances at us. Every minute we spent out here in the heat was torture, and to them, me and Harris were only prolonging their suffering. "What's wrong with it?" asked Wright. "Some kind of interference, sir," answered Harris, experimenting with the various switches on the receiver. "I don't know if..." The whole patrol cursed and covered their ears as every single radio suddenly erupted in a deafening chorus of shrill squawks and whistles. After several seconds, the deluge of sound stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my ears ringing. Sergeant Wright didn't answer, instead activating his own radio. "Command, can you read me? Over," he said, testing the connection. There were a few seconds of silence, then the receiver chirped to life. "This is Command, over. We have equipment malfunction here. Some sort of radio interference. Anything of that sorta base, over." "Something just happened to us as well, Sergeant. All our systems went haywire for several seconds, then straight back to normal. Continue your patrol, but be careful. Report any activity immediately. Over." The line went dead. Sergeant Wright brandished his rifle. "You heard the order, men. Move out. Eyes sharp." We set out again. The sun still beat down, but we were no longer lethargic from the heat. Adrenaline had purged that weakness from our minds. All eyes were up, scanning our surroundings intently. After half an hour of walking, we spotted something in the distance. A strange bump in the terrain. Harris brought his binoculars up, scanning it intently. "What is it, Harris?" I asked. "I thought it was all planes out here." "It is," he said, lowering the binoculars. "Or at least, it was supposed to be. There's some sort of low hillock there, though." We pushed on, cautious and alert. Eventually, we reached the strange bump. It wasn't high, only a few meters tall, but it was wide, stretching out far on both sides of us. We climbed to its top and stopped in awe. Before us was a massive chasm, a circular hole into the ground, almost 200 feet across. Peering down, all I could see was darkness, the bottom nowhere in sight. A cold, clear drought hit me in the face. "What is this?" I mumbled, one of the soldiers. This isn't supposed to exist." Sergeant Wright unslung his pack, hauling out a large field map. He unfolded it and scanned across it, locating our position. His face screwed up in confusion. "Whatever this is, it isn't on the map." He said at last, "You're right. It isn't supposed to be here at all." "Sergeant, look," said Harris. His voice had suddenly become very small and quiet. His eyes was distant. I followed his gaze. The sky was full of birds. Where they had come from so quickly, I didn't know. The flocks wheeled and swelled in strange patterns, like nothing I'd ever seen. As I watched, one bird suddenly stopped flapping its wings and streaked down. This was no controlled, graceful dive. It fell like a stone, cartwheeling and spinning uncontrollably, cawing and shrieking. It plummeted into the darkness of the pit and was gone. Another followed, then another. More joined in. In less than a minute, the air in front of us was filled with flailing bodies, all stone still as they fell down into the darkness of the chasm. They're killing themselves, whispered one of the soldiers. They're fucking killing themselves, man. We returned straight to base. Sergeant Wright immediately reported the chasm, of course. The confusion only grew after that. Not only was the hole not on our maps, it also didn't appear on any of the satellite images of the area, and no previous patrol had noticed it. It was as if it had just appeared out of thin air in the several seconds all our electronics went down. Theories flared up like fire. Was it an insurgent base? Had they hidden it somehow? It seemed like the most logical explanation, far-fetched though it was. The chasm quickly became known as 225199, after its grid coordinates. By the time Wright finished his report to command, night was quickly approaching and there was little time to formulate a response. As the sun fell, staining the plains orange and red, 2 troop carriers departed our base. 20 men were dispatched to guard 225199 until the next morning. On top of that, it was surrounded by motion-activated tripwires. If anything moved around it, we would know. I spent the evening discussing our findings with Harris in our tent. He was just as dumbfounded by the situation as I was. How the hell could someone keep a place like that secret? He asked me. Disassembled his rifle in his lap. Where would the locals get that kind of technology? I don't know, man, I answered, idly lighting a cigarette. Whatever it is, we'll find out tomorrow. Someone will probably get sent down there to recon, and then we'll know. What about those birds? That was weird as hell. Harris shrugged his shoulders. Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe there's some vapors coming out of it that paralyze or confuse them. I guess, I answered warily. Anyway, continued Harris, at least something interesting is happening. It's been too long since... The flap to our tent flew open, and we jumped to attention as Sergeant Wright swept in. Sergeant, what's... I began. Get your gear on now, soldiers. We're moving out. Move! He turned on his heel, running out of the tent immediately. We both sprung into action, putting on our equipment and shouldering readied packs. As we ran out into the night, we were immediately surrounded by bustling, anxious activity. The whole base was on its feet, men and women running around, preparing equipment and vehicles. What's happening? I yelled at Harris. I don't know, man, he answered, but I don't like it. We quickly joined the rest of our unit, the last to do so. Sergeant Wright gave us a withering look before clearing his throat and addressing the whole squad. 12 minutes ago, the proximity sensors around 225199 went off, all of them around the entire circumference at the same time. The unit dispatched to guard it reported movement before their radios went dead. Wright was silent for several seconds, and in the dark, I was almost certain he was trembling. What had he heard in his briefing that could make him react like this? Our orders are to move in, secure the location, and find our missing comrades. Be on high alert. We're not sure what we're dealing with out there. Our unit was ushered onto the bed of a truck, and we quickly drove out into the night. We weren't the only ones. Our vehicle was only one of dozens. Hundreds of men were being mobilized. It took little time to reach 225199 as the truck rolled to a halt. We jumped off its bed, weapons held high, panning the night. The hillock surrounding the abyss loomed above us in the darkness. We moved out, our progress slowed by both low visibility and our own wariness. Every shadow, every swaying scrub hedge seemed to be hiding the movement of an enemy. Something pale in front of me caught my eye. My weapon came up and I mumbled into the radio. "I have something." I approached the thing slowly. At first, I couldn't make out any details, but as I moved forward, the shape resolved. A man lying on the ground. He was naked, stripped of all clothes and equipment. He wasn't moving. I rushed forward to him. "I need a medic at my location immediately," I cried into the radio, my heart hammering. Behind, I could hear footsteps as the rest of my unit closed in, covering me. I knelt down at the prone figure. Still, he didn't move. The man was lying face down and I reached under him to roll him over. As I shifted his body, my heart plummeted. It was cold. Too cold. No living being could ever be this cold. "Command, I have a..." My voice trailed off. The way the body had moved as I turned it over, the way it had felt, it had been strange. I couldn't place my finger on why. With a rush of disgust and horror, I realized why. The body was horribly soft, pliant, the limbs bending at grotesque angles, as if made of rubber. The body had no bones. I bent over and retched onto the ground. A hand gripped my shoulder, and the face of Sergeant Wright appeared next to me. Figures came out of the dark, medics and soldiers. "Come with me, Private," said Wright quietly, putting his arm around my shoulders. "There's nothing you can do here." I don't... I began, but a fresh bout of nausea silenced my objections. Many strong arms grabbed me and led me away. I don't remember the journey back to the base. Harris told me that only a few trucks returned. Most of the soldiers stayed behind, scouring the land for the rest of the missing unit. They never found them. In the morning, Sergeant Wright informed me that I was to stay on base that day. The rest of my unit would be going to the local village to ask them for potential information on the attackers from last night. I didn't complain. A horrible memory of that morbidly soft, pliant body had seared itself into my mind. I needed time to recover. But as the day wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night and the corpse I'd found. What could possibly do something like that to a man? How could his bones be removed from his body? I had seen no obvious injury that might have explained such a hideous disfigurement. Had I simply missed it in the dark? My morbid thinking was finally interrupted as my unit returned. I could immediately see that something was wrong. Where usually they would be playfully taunting each other or discussing the situation on base, they were quiet and brooding. Harris sat down on his cot opposite me. He was pale, his eyes darting and furtive. "Harris, what's wrong?" I asked, confused. It's nothing, Josh," he answered quietly. "Did something happen in the village? Are the locals all right?" "They're fine. They didn't tell us what happened at 225199. "Then what's wrong? Why is everyone acting like this?" Harris looked up at me, his eyes filled with an uncertain, unknowable terror. A chill ran down my back. "They know something, man. They wouldn't tell us. Even when Wright lost his temper and threatened them, kept saying they didn't do it." "Then what?" "That's not all they said, Josh. We talked to the young ones first, of course. You know how the locals are. The older they are, the more they hate us. No one wanted to talk to us. They just looked down and said they didn't know anything. We were about to leave, but then some old crone started shouting. She had kept silent all the time, but she finally opened up. "What did she say?" I asked. Without realizing it, I had dropped my voice to a whisper. She said that her people were innocent, that something else had taken our men. She called it something strange, older than light. She warned that we should forget about them and pray that we won't be next. This was 5 days ago. Today, we finally received orders. The entire base is moving out. The decision was made way up the chain of command. Someone in charge seems to think that the chasm is home to a terrorist cell, and we are being sent to flush them out. I don't think any one of us here actually believes that. The people giving the orders haven't seen what we've seen. We surrounded the chasm from all sides. Our advance covered by armored vehicles and hovering helicopters with weapons trained on the abyss. Military engineers moved in. They've constructed a massive pulley system that will lower dozens of men at a time into the darkness on a huge platform. An hour ago, we were supposed to begin descending. All units were standing ready, awaiting their turn. The mood was grim. Harris held a well-worn crucifix in his fist and mumbled prayers. The air around us thrummed with the spinning rotors of attack helicopters. They were once again covering the abyss, all weapons readied. From up there, they had a commanding view of the area and could even peer down into the darkness. I didn't see the moment things went to shit. Harris suddenly cursed, pointing upwards at the sky, his face pale. What the fuck? The fuck? I followed his gaze. High above us, the hovering helicopters swayed madly, as if their pilots were intoxicated. The sergeants were screaming into their radios, requesting information, orders, anything. Suddenly, the aircraft lurched forward, drawn like marionettes by an insane puppet master. They swung towards the dark chasm. One by one, the pilots stalled their rotors and plummeted gracefully down into the blackness. Whatever it is we found out here, it's not natural. It's not of this earth. We cannot fight it or send it back to wherever it came from. I want you to pray. Pray for our missing comrades. Pray for the pilots we've lost. Pray for us as we journey down to where they fell. But most importantly, pray that whatever dwells in that dark chasm doesn't come out. Pray that you're not next. She looked just like my mother. That's what I thought when I saw her crouching in the gutter, vomiting God knows what into the road. The streetlights illuminated a giant figure with stringy blonde hair, pale skin, and a huge patchwork cardigan. My mother had been a kindergarten teacher before cancer took her. She always wore bright, soft clothing like that, even on her days off. I don't usually approach homeless people. Maybe that makes me a bad person. But you hear all these scams about people begging, then getting into a brand new Mercedes when the night falls, or wasting their money on booze and drugs. My mother would never have done any of those things. I think that's why I approached her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Was the most stupid question I could have asked, but I went with it anyway. Up close, she looked a bit less like my mother. Her green eyes were darker, and she had a thin, pale scar stretching from the top of her eyebrow to the beginnings of her hairline. "Do I look okay to you?" It's something my mother would definitely have said back. My face reddened. The woman, not my mother. I tried to remember. wiped her mouth on her sleeve as though I wasn't there. Well, should I take you up to see a doctor? Up close, she looked about as exhausted and miserable as any person I have ever seen. The bags under her eyes were heavy and dark. When she belched, I saw a couple of teeth were missing. I'd rather have a roof over my head. These nights are cold, you know. She stopped and gave me a long once-over. I was wearing a thick fleece jacket, gloves, a scarf knitted by my best friend. My arms were laden with gifts bought for the festive season. My face turned even redder. I felt like a glutton under the gaze of this woman who I had only just met. The woman stood up and stepped closer. This close she reeked of unwashedness and a stale something I couldn't place. But there was something else underneath. Lavender. Beneath the dirt, she had the exact same scent as my mother's old lavender perfume. Poppy Poppin', have you got a place for me to stay? Her whisper was hoarse but kind. Poppy Poppin'. I hadn't heard that nickname since the day my mother died. I set her up in the guest room, making sure the nicest sheets were on the bed. It's a small room, but cozy enough with room for the odd bits and bobs the woman had brought with her. Somehow I hadn't noticed her bag at first. It was huge, more like Santa's sack than anything. It contained blankets, small bags of snacks, tobacco, and some strange things too. Like a picture of a woman and her child. Too blurry to make out any strong details, but the child had bobbed blonde hair and a pink dress I remembered throwing a fit about wearing when I was 7 years old. Inside a small Ziploc bag, she kept a small cluster of baby teeth. I tried not to stare at them too much, but of course she noticed. From a little girl who looks just like you, she said, cackling. I reckon if I plant them someday, something might grow. The other things were equally bizarre. There was a clay figure of a fox, missing an ear, wrapped in newspaper. My mother had loved watching the foxes in our garden at dawn, running back towards the woods. Had I made a clay fox for her once? Finally, she had a small coin purse. Inside were coins, of course, but also some other things. A tiny square of paper folded many times. I was too polite to ask to see, but again, she saw me looking. This? She asked. This now is my most prized possession. Since you're so nice and gave me a room, I'll show it to you. When she unfolded the picture, my heart leapt into my throat. It was a child's drawing of a woman with bright yellow hair and green eyes. She wore a rainbow jumper, baby blue jeans, and had bright orange circles for feet. In one hand, she held an ice cream cone dripping onto the floor. In the other, she held the hand of a familiar little girl. Mummy, I love you forever from Poppy. I didn't need to see the wax scribbles to remember that day in art class. I had been upset because Danny Keenan had broken the best green crayon, so I had to use a different shade for my mother's eyes. I also remembered taking it home to share with my mother. I was bursting with pride when she pinned it to the refrigerator. Love you forever. The woman didn't say anything. She just smiled. She stayed in my house for 6 days. During that time, she was a model guest. That first day, I woke up thinking she was going to have robbed me in my sleep, or been waiting around the door with a kitchen knife and my wallet in hand. Neither of those things happened. Instead, I woke up to the smell of freshly cooked bacon. She raided the fridge and put together an almost passable English breakfast. Just like my mother, never too good at cooking. We settled into a routine quite quickly. She left the house when I went to work. I never dared ask where she went, but she always came back with her coin purse a little heavier. On a couple days, she came back with stranger things. One was another small photograph in black and white of a little boy and his white-haired grandmother. Cried when giving me that. She announced proudly through a mouthful of cottage pie. Another was a child's plastic charm bracelet, with pink and purple beads spelling out the name Jennifer. She didn't want to talk about that one at all and buried it at the bottom of her sack. But every night the woman vomited, around midnight, some perverse Cinderella's curse. I heard her run to the bathroom every night to throw up whatever she had eaten. It reminded me of my mother's long days of chemotherapy. A few times I called out to see if she was okay, but never received a response. Perhaps she was sick and too embarrassed to tell me. I considered calling a doctor, but really, she seemed perfectly well at all other times. Maybe she had an anxious stomach. I tried to bury it in the back of my mind. Those 6 days seem like a blur now. It felt like I had my mother back. The first day I was at the shop right as it opened and bought lavender-scented everything. Soap, shampoo, conditioner, body lotion, the works. After she showered, my house reeked of my mother's scent. I also gave her a few things to keep her busy. A romantic novel my mother had read 100 times while waiting for chemotherapy, and a pair of slippers she'd worn around the house for as long as I could remember without them ever getting faded or dirty. The woman accepted these gifts like treasures, but she never asked what they meant. Sometimes I thought I saw tears in her eyes. I never thought to ask for her name. The answer seemed so clear in my head. On the 6th day, I took the day off work and cooked my mother's favorite meal. Roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, Yorkshire puddings, and thick gravy. For dessert, I spent hours carefully rereading her old recipe book to make the cake she'd always prepared for my birthday. It was chocolate filled with jam and cream, and covered in small red and white piped flowers. Instead of an age, however, I just piped the word mother. That's the only time I ever saw the woman look angry, but only for a second. It flashed into her eyes so quickly I thought I had mistaken it, but her mouth hardened into a line and her eyes seemed to tear up again. Quickly I realized she wasn't angry with me, but with herself. Mother, ma'am, is everything okay? Yes, Poppy Puppet, she said, though the smile on her face seemed to tremble. You have done me good, ever so well. Any mother would be proud to have a daughter like you. I couldn't hide the happiness in my face. I only wished that hers didn't look so tired. I almost asked a question. Almost, but something was still stopping me. It didn't matter. On the 7th day, the woman told me everything. I'm not your mother, Poppy. The woman spoke while buttering some lightly burned toast the next morning. I was halfway through a mouthful of baked beans. Trying not to choke, I struggled to answer. What? Look, I know I look just like her. We have the same habits and clothes. Hell, I even smell like her now, thanks to you. But I am not your mother. Her smile was the kindest and most painful I have ever seen. I am so grateful to you and so sorry, but I can't be her forever. My mind was racing. I remembered 100 little things. When she read the romance novel, she folded the corners of the pages just like my mother used to do, to my deep annoyance. Neither of them could cook anything without it coming out a little bit wrong. Her cardigan was identical to one my mother wore in a school photo. Secretly, I had scoured through photo albums and found the match. They both had a slightly nasal laugh, brushed their hair behind their ears with the same gesture, belched like pigs after a good meal, and didn't care for anything cooked too spicy. They wore the same clothes and shoes, before my mother's chemotherapy, I mean. Blonde hair and green eyes, the baby teeth, the drawing, Poppy, Poppin'. But the drawing, it shows you whatever you want to see, darling. Take another look. She took out the same piece of paper and held it in front of my face. Think of your happiest memory. Something that always brings joy to your face. Go on. As I thought, the crayon scribbles seemed to rearrange themselves. I saw myself, my mother, and my father on a trip to the zoo. My parents had bought me a stuffed lemur almost as big as myself. I had wrapped a striped tail around my neck like a scarf. My father was doing impressions of the animals to make us laugh. My mother wore the same cardigan as her kindergarten days and held ice creams for all of us. How is this possible? Now think of your worst memory, the one that makes your heart feel broken. You know it. I didn't want to, but it flooded back so fast I could barely keep up with the flowing crayon scribbles. First I saw my father lying in a hospital bed after the accident. He'd been crushed by a forklift at work. His lower half was covered by many thick blankets to stop me seeing the gore, but a little blood seeped through. He'd wanted to see me one last time, knowing he was too hurt to survive. Next, of course, was my mother. The sight so many tubes and wires attached to her, like Medusa's snakes, turned me to stone. I couldn't look away from the beeping of the machines or the paleness of her face, or the baldness of her head that looked so vulnerable beneath the fluorescent hospital lights. I wish someone had given her a cap to cover it. Tears ran down my face into my breakfast. The woman was crying too, but her tears were strange. I was a mess of tears and snot, but her tears ran down her face perfectly straight. Her nose didn't run, nor did her eyes look red. It was as though she had a computer animation running on her face. We call ourselves the Sorrows. We come from nowhere, and we have nobody and nothing. We don't know what we are. We live as humans and change to meet how humans wish to perceive us. For some, it's their parents. Others, even their children or ex-lovers. It's the only way we can receive any kindness in this cold, cold world. I thought of every poor street beggar I had ever turned my nose up to. I thought of not my mother, vomiting into the gutter like a round of chemo gone bad. Why do this? Why pretend to be my mother? How can you do this? It's how we survive. It's remarkably easy to get any information from your brains. I know all of your likes and dislikes. I could describe any life story in great detail. For example, your 16th birthday. Your mother had baked a cake, just like the one you made yesterday for me. But you were angry because of an argument with your best friend and wanted to cancel the party altogether. Your mother tried to be patient, but in the end, both of you were yelling at each other. When the first guests arrived, you were still arguing. But half an hour later, when the party in full swing, you had forgiven each other completely. I smiled. And then your best friend arrived an hour late. Amy was never on time, but she had brought you a present. 2, actually. One was a kid's friendship necklace. 2 hearts that fit together as an ironic kind of apology. The other was a CD you'd been wanting for months. You gave her the biggest slice of birthday cake and turned your living room into a nightclub filled with dancing and the smallest glasses of wine. I could feel the gift paper pressed into my hands. The pounding of that year's most popular song echoed in my ears. Amy, always smelling of vanilla perfume, and her hands on my shoulders as we slow danced, giggling and pretending to be madly in love. Only I wasn't quite pretending. People like you are kind, but you'd never let any old stranger into your home. I understand that. Humans can be dangerous, but you also turn your eyes from us on the streets. If I were an old man, would you stop to see me vomit in the road? If I were a runaway, would you offer me money or a hotel room to stay in? I didn't need to answer. My shame spoke for me. You are kind to me because you want your mother back. That doesn't mean you are a cruel or ungenerous person. It simply makes you human. But I can't bring her back. Your mother will always be dead, and I really am just a sorrow. I can't stay here forever. My head snapped up. What? Why not? I gestured to the kitchen scene around us. We looked as comfortably domestic as any other mother and daughter. We could pretend. You'd have a roof over your head, and maybe I'd have a family again. The shaking of her head broke my heart again. You'd start to notice the cracks, the parts of me that aren't quite like her. You still don't like to see my scar, do you? I blushed. It was true. I always averted my eyes from the thin line striping her face. And darling, my eyes will never, ever be green enough. These are all little things, but I promise, those would increase in time. My grief was a physical thing, just like it had been when my mother really died. It felt like hands were gripping my heart and squeezing out all the good and bad memories of my mother with it. The strength of it made it hard to breathe as I fell back into my chair, willing the memories to either stop or take me away for good. So what will you do now? I was surprised I could even manage the words. The woman finished eating her toast. Today I will go walking again. Tonight I will pack my things and leave in the morning. It is time for me to move on, but it has been lovely knowing you, Poppy Poppin'. She rose from the table and began to wash the dishes. The best china I'd set out especially for her. I stayed put, my mouth now shut tight, thick tears still leaking from swollen eyes. I was only vaguely aware of the woman moving around the kitchen, drying dishes, scraping away the abandoned food from my plate, and finally fishing out some tissues to dry my face. I blew my nose and looked up at her face. Her scar seemed more severe than before. Would that make it easier? If I focused on all the wrongness and none of the right? I still had 100 questions to ask the woman. At this time I chose only one. Why do you go walking? The woman stood still. Emotions played over her face like a child flicking through a flip book. Sorrows like us need to eat, not your ordinary kind of food. It's best if you don't ask too much. A few minutes later, the woman was ready to go walking. I stood by the gate and waved her goodbye. She was wearing my mother's cardigan and clutching an empty sack. Before the woman left that night, I crept into her room. I knew she was awake and could see me. I didn't care. I tiptoed over and opened the sack she had filled with belongings again. I saw some of the same things. Blankets, baby teeth, the drawing that showed my mother again. Also some new things. A man's watch, old but still ticking, a thin wad of cash, a generic greetings card that looked like it had been written in a hurry, with a 50-pound note folded inside. Also some scraps of clothing. They looked like t-shirts and jeans, all covered with blood and bits of gore. I think Sorrows must have quite the appetite. Holding back tears, I added my own bundle to the sack. a bottle of lavender perfume, a box of the biscuits my mother had always bought whenever they went on sale, a bottle of red wine gifted to my mother one Christmas and still untouched, a bundle of her t-shirts and long flowing skirts, and of course the patchwork cardigan. When I left the next morning, it was as though the room had never been touched at all. I've met other sorrows since then. I try to give a little money or food to any homeless person I see. Sometimes it's clear they're drunk or on drugs. I don't let it bother me. We all have our demons, but we still deserve care. I've met some familiar faces there too. One looked like Amy. She also stayed for 6 days. We talked about the argument we'd had that birthday. How I'd had a huge crush on her, but she was as straight as a ruler. I found the matching friendship necklace she'd bought and wore it under my shirt. We made mooncakes together and talked about how much she'd missed me as a child when she went back to Taiwan every summer. She even taught me a little Mandarin. After the sorrow left, I called the real Amy for the first time in years. She's married now with twin sons and a wonderful husband who volunteers at a homeless shelter. I still haven't found the nerve to ask him about the sorrows. Another sorrow I met looked like my grandfather. I only knew him for the first few years of my life. When I think of him, I remember the smell of peppermint sweets and the endless carpentry he'd do in his garage. We spent a lot of time together doing things we never had a chance to do. Him teaching me how to drive, hearing his own father's stories about the war, and me learning 100 little stories from discovering his love of carpentry to discovering his love for my grandmother. After his 6 days, he left me an immaculately carved wooden poppy on my kitchen table. I never tried to look through their things. Sometimes they came home with blood on their clothes. Each sorrow apologized profusely, and I never saw so much as a speck when it came to do the laundry. It took a lot of effort not to wonder where it came from. When the last sorrow left, I followed him. He looked like my uncle, the oldest child of his generation. He'd passed away in my teens after a wild life of alcohol and parties. I remembered him as short, dark-skinned, pot-bellied, and with thick, bleached blonde hair that never seemed to thin or turn gray. He always wore the same jacket to family reunions, purple suede. He always jokingly compared him to Prince. We had parties every night for the 6 days we spent together. He drank enough wine to drown a man and showed me drinking games even my university days hadn't taught me. Even with his stature, he danced effortlessly with the grace of a rock star too cool to acknowledge the audience cheering at his feet. He always called my pops, never Poppy, and made jokes about the heavy-lidded eyes and strong jaw I'd inherited from my father. I didn't plan to follow him. I just did. After I heard the door close that 7th morning, I put on my warm winter jacket and packed a bag full of warm blankets and snacks, just in case I met any homeless people on the way. The thick snow falling from the sky made it easy to follow his footsteps from a distance. The air was so chill, I shivered in my winter coat. I doubted the sorrow's purple suede was enough to keep him warm. But as he walked, he seemed to blur. It happened like my glasses were steaming up after entering a hot room. He grew taller and thinner, and the purple suede jacket faded into a thin navy shirt. His hair was gray and straggly. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it had to be creased with wrinkles. Was this the sorrow's true form? Even from a blurred distance, the pity I felt for him was overwhelming. He looked just like an elderly man with nowhere to go, bumbling about the streets of the city. Eventually, he stopped outside a coffee shop and put down his sack beside the nearby bench. It had bars built in, so he couldn't lie down. Instead, he looked out a blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Entering the coffee shop, he had a short conversation with the barista. I could see the pity on her face. She gave him 2 cups, one steaming with coffee and the other empty. When he settled on the bench outside, he left the empty cup perched in the snow before him. He didn't need to write a message. I walked over to him and unzipped my backpack. Silently, I gave him another blanket, a packet of crisps, and a handful of coins. He nodded slowly and said nothing. I went into the cafe and chose a window seat. Lots of people walking by paid the sorrow no interest, even as the snow gathered upon his shoulders. Still, some were kind. One carefully dumped the snow out of his coffee cup and wiped the coins inside dry with her scarf. Another helped him shake his blanket free of snow. Some gave him loose change, and twice he was given drinks from the coffee shop. But few of the passers-by seemed to recognize him. The first one looked like she'd been hit by a truck. She was an older woman with thick black hair and dark eyes. The moment she saw him, she stopped dead. People complained as they moved around her. The sorrow himself hadn't changed so fast. It took me a moment to notice his own thick black hair and olive skin. The woman babbled something excitedly in Spanish, and the sorrow replied, laughing as though he weren't sitting up upon a freezing street. Though I understood little, it was clear she was offering to help. Strangely, though, he seemed reluctant to follow her down the street. Eventually, the woman opened her purse and emptied the contents into his cup as the sorrow thanked her profusely. Then she took the scarf from her neck and wound it around his. Both seemed to cry a little as this one little gesture. I made eye contact with the sorrow as the woman left. He showed nothing on his face. The other was a man who looked to be in his late 60s. He was a tall Asian man who walked with a cane and held a bundle of Christmas presents in his other hand. When he saw the sorrow, she was a young woman with long braided hair, dark eyes, and a school uniform that looked foreign. I saw the exact moment he spotted the sorrow. He didn't quite stop dead, but he moved towards her, slowly and carefully, until they stood watching each other closely. Neither of them exchanged words. Cautiously, the man opened one of his shopping bags and pulled out a pre-wrapped gift, handing it to the sorrow. He muttered just one sentence that I was able to lip read. "You look just like she did. Please, take care." The sorrow unwrapped the gift after the man struggled away. It was a stuffed toy of a popular children's character. Attached to it was a note I could just read from the window. "I remember and miss you every day. I hope you have a wonderful, heavenly Christmas. With love from your doting father." It was late afternoon when the sorrow began to change again. The streets were packed with people returning home from work. Clutching my third hot chocolate of the day, I held the book half-heartedly in front of me as I pressed my nose to the window. The blurring was easier to see at this angle. He became younger and female with long, curly hair and beautiful dark skin. As she blurred, the sorrow's clothing changed to a stained red woolen dress with a gray cardigan and matching red mittens. A hole in one of them meant her fingers poked through. She wore battered brown boots with the laces missing and drooping knee socks patterned with hearts. More than anything, she looked like a student fallen on hard times. As soon as she began to move, I discarded my book and followed her. She moved slowly, as though walking caused her pain, and I noticed one of her legs was slightly shorter than the other. I followed her through the increasing snow, across streets, down alleys, until we were in a completely different part of the city. Still, no one but me seemed to have noticed her. We reached a park. The sorrow sat on the bench. I sat on the one opposite. We simply sat and observed each other. For a brief moment, I saw my father's eyes in her face. It was as the sun set when the man appeared. He looked rich, tall, tanned, blonde, and muscular. He wore a suit that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. His shoes were polished leather, and his scarf had to be cashmere. All that he needed was a briefcase to complete the look. He had barely turned the corner before he saw the sorrow. He stopped dead. His voice was weaker than I had expected. Julia? Is that you? The sorrow said nothing. She only looked at him with cold, emotionless eyes. A bruise started to form just below her left cheekbone. The man looked on the edge of panic, but he seemed unable to move. Julia, this can't be you. Say you're not her. How can you be here? How did you find me? With every word, something new happened to the sorrow. Her nose caved in as if struck by an invisible punch. Her clothes looked more and more tattered. One of her eyes was filled red with blood. One arm hung loosely, clearly broken at the wrist. Answer me. What is happening? How are you here? When the sorrow spoke, her jaw unhinged like that of a snake. Her teeth were pointed. You thought you had killed me and gotten away with it, Brian. The man clamped his mouth shut. He seemed unable to move. You beat me day and night. You said it was because you loved me so much. You couldn't bear other men looking at me, or my male friends texting me, or my parents disliking you, or 100 more petty little things. Sometimes you just had a bad day, so you beat me, but I loved you, so I stayed. I wasn't sure if the man would ever speak again. But one day, you came home from work drunk. You'd had a fight with your boss over a missed promotion, then stopped at a bar on the way home. You were very drunk and very angry. I tried to embrace you. You pushed me into a wall. A horrific injury was forming at the back of the sorrow's head. It was like someone had caved in her skull with a bat, or maybe a bottle. Old, blackened blood matted her hair. I tried to apologize, but every sorry seemed to make it worse. You hit me again and again, and I begged you to stop. The more I begged, the worse it got, so I became quiet. I wanted you to leave me alone, but my silence seemed to give you a different idea. You left me broken and sobbing on the kitchen floor, and came back with a rolling pin from the kitchen. The only other sound was the snow falling gently around us. The sorrow stood up. That was a real dick move, Brian. I had been using that rolling pin to make biscuits for my mother's birthday, but instead you used it to cave in my skull. You beat me so many times. It stopped feeling like a wound and more like the pounding of my poor, broken heart. When I died, I wasn't even mad at you. I only wondered what I had done to make you so angry. Have you ever seen a rabbit, knowing it's about to be caught by a fox? That's how this man looked when the sorrow approached him. Julia wasn't mad at you, Brian. But I am. Her jaw shot out, and her teeth seemed to extend as they punctured his face. Screaming, the man sunk to his knees, the sorrow descending on him like a monster desperate to feed. I sat and watched as she devoured him without mercy. Blood, guts, bones, and all. I expected the snow to turn red, but his blood seemed to fly towards the sorrow with a magnetic force. His wailing only ended after she clawed the heart from his chest and stripped it into pieces with her new, talon-like claws. With every piece swallowed, her injuries seemed to heal a little, until the only sign of the man was the shredded, expensive suit on the ground. Finally, when it was over, the sorrow looked over to me. Panic seized me. Would she let me live, knowing what I had seen? But I too felt too paralyzed by fear to run. I didn't want to become another bundle of fabric on the ground, but my knees refused to let me stand up. The sorrow came and sat beside me. As she moved, she blurred and morphed and changed again. Finally, she became an image of my father. You have helped many sorrows in this city, providing you live a good and kind life. We will never harm you. The man you saw was a killer who ruined the life of a wonderful young woman. You know how poor the justice system is when the killer is white and the victim is not. I nodded. This was a familiar conversation with my mixed-race father. He got away with everything. I decided he needed to pay. Do you think I made the right decision? I stared at the mass of ruined clothing across the park. Brian Redfern was the oldest of 3 children. He has 2 living parents, both of whom doted on their children. He grew up upper class and became a leading professor in neuroscience. His research saved many lives. He has a family who loves him, a close group of friends, and a new girlfriend who he has never so much as struck in anger. Do you think I made the right decision? The sorrow put his hand on my knee. It felt warm and familiar. The same gesture my father used to make. After he killed Julia, he hid her body in a reservoir. It was found and he was a suspect, but the evidence wasn't enough. He had too many loyal supporters. Eventually, he was cleared of all charges. Julia's killer was never named, and her family misses her every day. She deserved better, was all I could think to say. She did. The sorrow nodded. Brian felt remorse. Not enough to confess, but some. He quit drinking the day after he murdered Julia. He donated a great deal of money to help Julia's family. They were much poorer than his. He still keeps in touch with her sister and listens to her grief. Is that kindness? It's grotesque. Brian thought he could redeem himself. I have to feed Poppy. All sorrows must feed. We eat humans, and we try to eat the ones who we think deserve it. The murderers, the rapists, the child abusers. But it's horrible work. Even though we're genetically meant to kill, it causes us great sorrow. Maybe Brian could have been redeemed if he'd turned himself in one day and faced the consequences of his actions. Do you think I made the right decision? Yes. My answer was instantaneous. You killed a monster to stay alive. That's what heroes do in books and films. Sorrow smiled sadly. I'm no hero. I just want to live. No sorrow understands where we came from, why we have to feed, and even how long we will live. I have lived a very long life, Poppy. I have fed upon many people, and been treated kindly by many more. Indeed, it's the kindness people like you give us that sustains us as much as the people we consume. Tears stung my eyes. But we're not good people. We only helped you because you remind us of people we love. Humans are complicated beings. That much we understand. It's good to help people for any reason, but it's also good to help people for selfish reasons. The most important thing is just to do good. Goodness will keep us alive until the end. I still had 100 questions, but my head was buzzing. The sorrow stood up and walked over to the shredded clothes. Whistling a tune from my childhood, he swept them into his sack. I chose one question, the one that mattered the most. Excuse me, will you stay with me? I have a room waiting for you. Stella had wanted to explore the tower ever since her father bought the castle. Her family had been driving up the mountains through the dark woods when she first saw it rising over the trees, attached to the east wing, but her mother refused to let her enter. She could only peek in through the square door on the third-floor hallway. Her father had explained that this part of the castle had not been modernized, that the tower was all the original and had a staircase that went up into nowhere. Or it didn't seem to go anywhere, since nobody could fit around the final 2 or 3 flights of stairs to reach the top. He had tried, but each flight got narrower and twistier until it was simply impossible to keep going, unless you wanted to get stuck. It was no surprise to Stella that her father had given up. He was shaped like a glass bottle, fat in the middle, narrow at the shoulders, with a tiny cork for a head. He had a fear of tight, closed spaces too, and told Stella and her mother that the walls got so close together that he had needed to drag his chest against the walls to keep going. Nonetheless, Stella wanted to explore it for herself. It seemed to her like the place of a tragic figure in a story might hide in, like Quasimodo. The only thing that could be said about this history of the tower was that the architect had been mad to build such a thing. Some crazed but imaginative nobleman from the Middle Ages had overseen its construction as much as 800 years ago. Now, standing in front of it, Stella watched breathlessly as her father inserted a long, spindly key, turned it, and the door shrieked open. "Oh, that sound makes my skin crawl," said her mother, and Stella felt her skin jittering like it had 1,000 little bugs under it. "Can I go in?" asked Stella. Her father pulled the door open wider so she could see inside. "I'm not so sure," he said, glancing at his wife for approval. He liked entertaining his daughter's adventurousness, but not in front of Eleanor. Stella stood beside him and peered into the little, empty room. Simple, square, and wooden. Moonlight poured in through an unadorned window and illuminated the first steps of the staircase. It all looked disappointingly normal, except what it seemed to be made of someone very short. It would not have been too small for Stella, who was not a tall girl. She was only 14 years old and had not started growing in earnest. "Please, can I go in?" "Let's at least get a flashlight." "Harlan!" yelled Eleanor. "Well, your mother's right, Stella. Imagine if you got stuck, and there aren't any lights, you know. There's no electricity in there." "I just want to look up the staircase." "Don't be silly," said Eleanor. "There could be rats. Nobody's fixed it up. It's probably never been cleaned." "I did hear some scratching noises when I went in," said Harlan, "and the whole thing could be full of termites. Really, it's not a good idea." "Just let me see the staircase, please." Harlan appealed to Eleanor with his round eyes, but she refused. "Maybe another time," he said appeasingly. "At least wait until morning." He shut the door with another ghastly shrieking that made their skins crawl again. Then he dropped the spindly keys into his pocket. Stella dreamt about the tower that night. She stole the whole spindly key from her father's office and then went in. In her dream, it was daytime and the entrance was as bright as any other room in that castle, maybe even brighter. She went leaping up the stairs, up, and the sunshine felt warm on her face. Then she woke up in her new bedroom, which had a view of the tower, rising upward like a long neck with a little head on top. Her room was empty still. The moving trucks were arriving that day, and she would spend most of the time unpacking. Her room had a high curved ceiling with a baroque embellishments, like all the other rooms in the castle. Even stranger was the monstrous fireplace that gaped like a mouth in the wall, a relic of a long-forgotten time when an ancient European family needed fires every night in winter. The castle still had many of these obsolete features. It was obvious that someone from every century had lived there, and the occupants of each of those centuries had contributed something to it. The last family to have done so had moved in during the 1920s, or so her father said, and they had stayed until the 1970s, updating it with modern conveniences. But for some reason, the castle had been abandoned since 1978, when her father bought it. He was always spending money on useless, expensive things, like that collection of ancient teeth belonging to extinct animals. The castle was his most recent extravagance. As Stella left her room that morning, she hoped to be allowed into the tower for a better look. But to her disappointment, everyone was busy with the movers, telling them to put this here, that there, on and on all day until the castle was a hazard of boxes and furniture. By the time things calmed down, it was already 4 o'clock and the sun went down a half-hour later. Stella gazed outside as the sun sank, and somewhere behind the castle itself threw its shadow over the forest ahead of her. For a few minutes, the sunlight went directly through the windows of the tower, which got smaller and smaller closer to the top, until finally they were as small as the tiles in her newly renovated bathroom. Each of its floors were closer together than the last two, scrunched up like an accordion. Stella wanted more than anything to crawl up to the top and see for herself the odd room that had never been seen by anyone for 800 years. Dreams of medieval treasures saturated her imagination. She imagined chests of gold and old silk gowns, jewelry with gems the size of her eyes, or old books with ancient symbols, hidden there by a madman who wanted to protect them forever. At dinner, she asked her father about it again. "I really don't think it's a good idea to be playing around in there, Stella." "Why can't I just look?" "Stella," said Eleanor sharply, whose words jabbed at her daughter with the same twisty pointness of her face. "Don't you know how old it is? One of those steps could be eaten through by rats and termites and who knows what else, and you'd fall straight to the bottom. Is that what you want? It's probably crawling with spiders, too. Whatever romantic idea you have about it is probably all wrong. I'm already furious with your father for going up there. Just think, if you were to get stuck." And she trembled all over, as if she had felt very cold. The conversation turned to Stella's younger cousin Jacob, who was around 10 years old and would be staying with them that summer. Stella knew he would be curious about the tower too, and they could probably work together to find some way of poking around inside. Her parents trusted her to watch him, and even though she was just 14, she was often home alone, sometimes until late. Stella didn't mind. She was eagerly waiting for her parents to go out to dinner, or to have drinks, or whatever they did. It now seemed unlikely they would disappear for very long, since the castle was in the middle of nowhere, but no matter. The place was so large that it had started to feel like living alone, even when it had all three of them inside. When Jacob arrived the next day with his parents, the first thing Stella did was tell him about the tower and show him the iron door with the lock. Even though he could see the tower with his own eyes, he had trouble believing her about the staircases. He got his first glimpse along with his parents during Harlan's tour. Neither he nor Eleanor could resist showing it off as oddity to their first guests, and Stella foresaw many such future nights when her parents would tipsily guide their guests up to the third floor, talking on and on about the twisting, turning tower like an abstract masterpiece, then slip in the spindly key and let them stand gawking at the doorway. So it was with Jacob and his parents, who peered in wide-eyed just like Stella had done. This time her father had brought a flashlight. "And it just gets smaller until you can't go up any further?" asked Jacob's mother. She was absent-mindedly swirling around the wine around in her crystal glass. "Incredible. It It reminds me of that tower in Florence. What's it called again? Snapping her fingers. Oh, Giotto's Tower. Do you know the one I mean? We were there last summer and we barely made it to the top. Or it's like the catacombs in Paris, said her husband. Except the tower goes up instead of down. Stella knew that Jacob's parents always looked for indirect ways of mentioning all the places they had been, which probably made normal people jealous, but not her own parents, since they had been everywhere too. Her mother had a haughty, satisfied look on her face as her husband shined the light around in the tower, as if they themselves had built it and could now cash in on its value as a topic of discussion. Have you ever been to the catacombs? Jacob's father went on. They don't get smaller and smaller like the tower here, but they are rather tight, and the depth it goes down into the earth is probably equivalent to the tower's height. Yes, said Eleanor, except I hope, as in the catacombs, we don't have a chamber full of skulls collecting dust at the top. They all laughed, but everyone's skin jittered as the closing door shrieked at them, as if to give warning in a language that none understood. Maybe you ought to get some kind of robot, or a drone that can go poking around, said Jacob's father. Yes, we heard about how the Egyptologists did that when we were visiting the Giza pyramids, said Jacob's mother. Stella couldn't think about anything else after she closed her eyes to go to sleep that night. Jacob shared her interest in the tower, but not her enthusiasm to sneak inside. She spent the whole hour trying to convince him as they lay on their separate beds, staring up into the dark ceiling. But what if we get stuck? Then one of us can go get help. What if we both get stuck? Or maybe I'm stuck in front of you and you can't get out. Then I'll go first, since I'm bigger. That way if I'm stuck, you'll definitely not be. Jacob lacked the intellectual capacity to argue with her. When she closed her eyes that night, she saw only the tower, and in her dreams she drifted up the stairs like a disembodied mind, turning and turning upward and upward, just a pair of eyes looking out, unencumbered by her physical body. But she always woke up before she reached the top. That morning at breakfast, Stella's parents took Jacob's parents out golfing at a resort 2 hours away by car, leaving her in charge of Jacob. The moment they left, Stella began searching her father's office for the long, spindly key. We're going to get stuck, said Jacob. Oh, stop worrying. I don't even know if I'll find the key. But she did know, because she knew her father well. Harlan was a simple, honest man, which meant he thought everyone else was as simple and honest as himself, especially his own daughter. He wouldn't have thought it risky at all to leave the key in any old place. Why not with the rest of the keys? And that's exactly where she found it, hanging in his office's glass cabinet on a hook. As her fingers touched it, she felt its ancientness at once. Her heart convulsed as if she had touched lightning. Jacob followed her to the iron door. Maybe I should stand watch here, in case someone comes back, or in case you get stuck. As you like, she said in a tone that Jacob hated, with her eyes fixed ahead of her, as if she were talking to herself. She slid the spindly key into the lock. It felt like it might break. She turned it carefully until something clicked. Then she opened the door. It shrieked and she peered inside. Daylight filled the room, empty but for glinting dust. It looked almost pleasant, though a little stuffy. It had an attic smell and she thought she might sneeze, but she didn't. Jacob stood at her side, his curiosity piqued. He hopped through the door and into the room. Jacob followed her in. Should I stay here? He asked. I said do as you like. Stella examined the room. There was no decoration at all and did not feel that small, just smaller than a normal room. It made one feel that something was not quite right. The ceiling came too low. The doorway was not high enough, and Stella had the impression of being much taller than she was. Jacob felt like an adult in the ordinary room. Like it had been built for him. Stella headed toward the stairs and Jacob went too. The stairs went up at sharp turns to the next level. Stella might not have noticed it was smaller than the first floor if no one had told her already. It became more pronounced as she reached the third level. As she continued higher, the change became obvious. The door frame to the fifth staircase brushed the top of her head, almost within a millimeter. She had to bend down slightly. Jacob continued along behind her, not having to duck. "It's like being at a circus," said Jacob, huffing a little. "You mean a carnival?" said Stella. Reaching the fifth floor, they rested and looked out the window. Their heads were now just about the same height as the room. Stella saw her bedroom window far below. Birds of all kinds were perched on different jutting points of the roof, which looked sharp and angular, and it made her think of her mother's face. "Let's keep going," she said. "Okay, but just a little." On the sixth staircase, Stella had to bend over and could no longer stand up straight. Jacob's little electrically charged hair stood up and dragged across the ceiling. They continued up the seventh staircase, not saying anything. They could hear something moving in the walls higher above them. And Stella thought of the rats her mother had mentioned. They kept going up, and Stella had to bend over more and more. On the 10th floor, even Jacob needed to crouch, and Stella's back had started hurting until they took another break and kneeled on the floor so she could stretch. The castle out the window looked far away and tiny. Stella saw parts of the modern road that wound around the mountain. She looked for signs of her father's Bentley, but saw nothing. Her thoughts strayed back to the highest room of the tower, filled with who knows what kind of things. If Stella didn't try to reach it now, she would probably be too tall next year. Catching her breath, Stella told Jacob they would go a little further, but turn around if they saw any spiders or rats. So they kept going up. Now they were on the 11th staircase. Stella had not realized it before, since it happened so slowly. But the turns in the stairway had gotten more angled, so the tower must seem to be turning in on itself. And the stairs were also getting steeper, and the distance between each step less consistent. Stella remembered something her father had once told her when she was out hiking with him. Only climb things you can get down easily. So many hikers get confident when going up steep cliffs that they forget it's much harder to come down than it is to go up. This flashed through Stella's mind as they reached the 14th floor. She was no longer just crouching. She was forced to bend over to such a degree that her hands were hanging around her feet, swaying like a monkey's, and she had to crawl into the next room on her hands and knees. It looked more like the inside of a dollhouse. The air tasted like dust, and she felt dizzy from being up so high. The scratchings in the walls also sounded closer than before, but they still hadn't seen any mice. If they went down now, they'd have to crawl on their hands, heads forward, or else they'd have to work their way backward and maneuver blindly around each turn. It had only taken them 20 minutes to come up this far, but it could take hours to get down. The first stirrings of panic fluttered in Stella's chest. Looking out the window didn't make her feel better. She had the sense of looking down at the castle as if through a distorted lens. Something about it looked odd. It had never been meant to be seen from this height and angle. She was looking down at the roof almost vertically, and felt like she might fall on it. Jacob had not been struck with the same panic. He still had the optimistic curiosity that Stella had felt a few floors below. He could see that she was not feeling well, though, and wanted to encourage her. "I think we're almost there." "You do? I mean, it can't go on forever." "No." Stella's breathing had returned to normal. She felt better. Something scratched and skittered, but she heard also the shifting of weight. A dragging of something across wood, but she wasn't sure. She might have imagined it. It's still not too small for us, she said to Jacob, but mostly to herself. It's impossible to get stuck like this. It's not that small yet. No, not yet. He now seemed to want it more than she did. Of course he did. He was smaller than her. He couldn't feel what it was like for someone her size. She couldn't stand the thought of cracking first, though. She was older and prided herself on being the brave one. Shaking a bit, she crawled toward the 15th staircase. It had become so steep that the stairs were more like ladders, and the children had to pull with their arms as well as push with their legs to make progress. Stella could hear Jacob grunting behind her. She kept thinking she could hear something ahead, moving around, but Jacob was too loud. She couldn't hear it well. His voice reached her from below. Shouldn't they go back now? It was getting pretty tight. Stella felt relief, mingling with fear. She had outlasted him. Now they could turn around, but first she wanted to punish him a little for being such a weakling. Almost there, she shouted down. Let me just have a peek. But as Stella's head poked up into the next floor, she saw the spider. It stood in the center of the narrow room, as narrow as a coffin. At once, the spider started jittering at her on its long, spindly legs, darting quickly. Stella screamed, tried to move down, but Jacob had followed behind her too closely and her arms were pressed against her chest. She shouted for Jacob to go back, but his voice came up from below her saying that he couldn't move either. He asked what was wrong, but Stella was too terrified to answer. The spindly-legged spider leaped onto her face and began clawing around her eyes and mouth. At the same time, Jacob cried out in terror. There was a rat. He started pushing against her, jamming her up higher, cramping her into the space at a painful angle. Her hands were trapped below her so that she could only flail around madly and try to shake the spider off. She couldn't see it or know if it was gone, yet she kept thinking she could feel it crawling on her nose, around her eyes, on her forehead, while Jacob kept pushing her up, up, up. Then as she felt the spider disappear into her hair, she heard the groaning noises above her. The floorboard stretched under the weight of something moving. Something was dragging itself, or being dragged over her head and toward the stairway in front of her, and the stairs creaked with the pressure of the thing moving down toward them. Move, Jacob! Move! Move! She shrieked the shriek of the tower door. Then her foot jammed down into Jacob's face, kicking into panic to dislodge him, but he could not move. He could only cry out in pain as Stella's foot smashed into his nose over and over again. Stop! Stop! But she could not stop. Shrieks. Shrieks like burning hooks as the thing slowly crawled out from the floor above her. And Jacob finally unstuck himself. I met Jared on a roommate matching board last May. Aside from his unique last names, he seemed completely normal. We had lived together for about 3 months before I noticed anything strange. It was around 3 in the morning. When I went into the living room to grab some lotion, the room was pitch black, so I turned on the light. When I saw Jared lying on the couch reading a book. Dude, what the hell? My voice startled him. How were you reading without the lights on? Jared's eyes went wide and his mouth opened. I wasn't reading, he stammered, putting the book down. I was just resting with the book in my hands. Yes, you were. I could see your eyes moving once I turned on the light, I said. Jared forced out an obviously fake yawn, then put the book down and closed his eyes. I'm just so tired. I wasn't thinking. I'm going to bed. And with that, he fell asleep. After that incident, I started paying more and more attention to him. and started noticing weird things. He never turned on the lights if he didn't need to, and he didn't have a shadow. I didn't mind, though. I mean, who am I to judge? He was still a good roommate, just a little quirky. Until one day, I started disappearing. It started on my feet. I woke up one morning to find that I didn't have a big toe. I was about to call 911 until I stubbed it on the side of my bed. So my toe was still there, I just couldn't see it. After a week or so, my entire right foot disappeared, meaning I had to wear socks all the time to hide it. Watch out! I spilled some orange juice. Jared shouted to me one morning. Oh shit, I already stepped on it, I said, trying to walk into the living room. Brad, take your socks off. You're gonna get orange juice stains on the living room carpet, Jared said to me. Fuck, I thought. I can't take my socks off. My feet are cold. Dude, come on. It's really hard to get stains out of white carpet, Jared said to me. Your room's right there. You can change into new ones. I guess. I sighed. I can't hide this from him forever. Okay, just don't get freaked out, I said as I took both my socks off. Jared just looked at me weirdly. Freaked out by what? Well, this, I said, gesturing to my entirely invisible foot. By now the invisibility had spread to the bottom of my leg, but Jared just looked even more confused. Looks like a normal foot to me, he said. What? Jared, come on. Something weird has happened. I stopped mid-sentence and stared behind him. You have a shadow, I said. Yes, Jared said really slowly. Everyone has a shadow. Well, yeah, most people have shadows, but you don't. Well, didn't, but now you do. I shouted, realizing how ridiculous I sounded. Where did you get your shadow from? Jared started backing up and picking up his cell phone. Bradley, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone? No, I'm fine. It's you that can see my invisible foot. I ran into my room and locked the door behind me, confused about what to do next. I decided to Google Jared's name to look for social media. He had a very unique set of last names. I'm not going to mention them here in case he sees this. What came up was an article from May 8th, 2019. Teenager dies from car crash. 18-year-old Jared was pronounced dead after a head-on collision at the intersection between Oak Street and Route 200. He had reportedly been walking home from work when the vehicle stopped straight into the grass, going approximately 25 miles per hour. The cause of death was reported to be extreme blood loss. It is estimated that he was alive for at least 5 hours after the collision. Police are currently investigating his death. If you have any information, please contact them. I checked my phone for any old pictures from that date. There were pictures of me drunk at a party, with lots of beer in the background. So you found my secret. Came Jared's voice from behind me. You're dead, I asked, horrified. I was dead, he said, sitting on my bed with a smile. Right now I'm stuck in between. So are you, actually. But see, once you start experiencing symptoms, they won't stop. You're going to turn entirely invisible, and then you will die, and I will have my life back. The life that you took from me. I thought I hit a deer, I shouted in protest. I wanted to call 911, remember? But then my friend Jason said that I just hit a deer, and I was drunk enough to believe him. Oh, I know. I took care of Jason already. That's how I got this body that you see. I'm just using you to finish the transition process. I cried and cried, but Jared just kept smiling. Eventually, he came over and comforted me. Shh, it's okay, he said soothingly. In the end, you two only really killed yourselves.